Okay, confession time. I am a total sucker for narratives like the one in Trilogy of Error. I'm sure that's a shock to you all, coming from the Simpsons Mysteries guy, but I eat this stuff up. Like, give me a simple Groundhog Day loop, show me variations on the same setup, and I'll automatically be interested. Sometimes I'll treat myself to an alternate timelines angle, where the repeating element gets skewed in a different way in each loop. Or how about a story about how interconnected everything is, and the coincidental webs we weave? Now obviously, all these examples are certainly not in the same genre, but I always think of these kinds of stories as butterfly effect narratives, where one little decision point can morph into several different outcomes, and can create a chain reaction with other people's decisions. These stories are great about giving us that big picture, understanding how the characters and themes truly fit together. Trilogy of Error is a conceptual homage to the 1999 film Go, with elements of 1998's Run Lola Run in there too. Thanks, Lisa. When you think of Trilogy of Error, its format is one of the first things you think of. But I think there's a danger with this kind of story in that the tail can start wagging the dog, where the connections and the narrative tricks get all the attention, and the actual story becomes relatively unimportant. It could be about anything, really. Like, if I recut the whole episode and watched each scene in chronological order, would Trilogy of Error still be a compelling story? Is there actual substance to the narrative? When it comes down to it, is Trilogy of Error just 3 shallow stories being told in the most interesting way possible? To answer that question, let's start out by looking at the story being told in each individual day, and how the narrative flows between them. First, Homer's Day. I think what works really well about Homer's storyline is what a strong inciting incident it has. The plot has to go all over the place, so we desperately need a goal to drive the story. And not just any goal, there has to be stakes. Cutting off Homer's thumb, while grisly to look at and very typical of this era, serves this purpose extremely well. Since this is the traditional Act 1 of the overall episode, the primary goal of Homer's Day needs to be the setup. It needs to start out really fast, introduce us to key characters and locations, foreshadow later storylines, and finish at the emotional low. It builds a strong framework, and then gets out of the way. In general, the writers have a good sense of what they need to set up in each storyline, as well as showing mysteries to push us forward to the next one. Just look at the differences between how Homer and Lisa's stories interact versus Homer and Bart's. Homer's obviously the lead into Lisa, so the plot threads between them have to be the strongest. Yeah, his story totally affects Bart in a very significant way, but it's conveyed to us more secretly. It's only Act 1, we'll worry about Bart later. Homer directly kickstarts Lisa's adventure with Linguo, and then his story is bookended by a mystery. How did Linguo end up like this? We know Linguo's starting and ending point, so naturally Lisa needs to come next. There's narrative cohesion here. We reset chronologically, but we don't lose the plot thread. I think Lisa's Day suffers the most of the 3 due to its placement in the middle. Lisa has to do a lot of the heavy lifting in connecting story elements up to both Homer and Bart, so hers tends to have the most exposition crammed into it. It has to piggyback onto Homer's existing storyline, explaining the mysteries of how Homer's rides keep abandoning him. Therefore, they're forced to put a lot of effort to fit her into the continuity. They have to show her leaving the rear exit of Moe's Tavern when Homer arrives, have Marge explain to Lisa how she ended up in Rainier Wolfcastle's car, stuff like that. Overall, there isn't a ton of substance to Lisa's story, it's mostly just a bunch of running around. Sure, you could argue that Homer's is the exact same thing, just a bunch of driving around, but his problem has much higher stakes, has more significant complications. The kind of complication Lisa encounters is simply being driven to the wrong place by Mr. Teeny. I don't think there's an easy way to fix this, because the most unique part of her storyline, the West Springfield Elementary stuff, is probably the weakest part of the whole episode. Like, Lisa meeting Thelonious is fine and all, it definitely kills some time in the morning so Lisa can get to Moe's around noon, but this set piece doesn't fit in with anything else. It feels very pointless and tangential. What does Lisa meeting a boy add to her overarching story? I wish they could have found something that fit into the Linguo storyline better, where they could still fill that time in the middle. Maybe Lisa needs to find Professor Frink to fix up Linguo or something. Speaking of tangential, Bart's Day is pretty much its own separate thing compared to Homer and Lisa's interconnecting stories. However, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. By Act 3, we don't want to keep repeating the same sequences or have to cram in a bunch of exposition. They were very clever to have Bart leave the kitchen scene first, allowing us to completely skip Homer and Lisa scenes during this final loop. I think they made the right call in making Bart's Day relatively hidden, only be hinted at in the first 2 acts. Honestly, it's pretty darn slick how they drop all these clues into jokes. This Wiggum joke about his informant sounds like every other incompetent Wiggum joke we'd expect. Finding out Bart's on the other side of it is a cool reveal. The 1, 2, 3 fake street thing is even better, just being a silly Marge throwaway line to make fun of Wiggum again. Then name dropping it a second time in Lisa's storyline. And finally, the big payoff to this running joke. Just perfectly executed. Love the dramatic cut to this address. The only nitpick to Bart's story is in its timing. The rest of the episode is fairly consistent in keeping track of its time. Lisa arrives at Moe's at noon, rides around in cars, and leaves Dr. Nick's clinic at around 2:50 p.m. That's over 2 hours of driving to Dr. Nick's, but whatever, it works. Maybe the clinic is far away. Where things get weird is when you factor Bart in here. Chief Wiggum blows Bart's cover around noon, when Lisa is at Moe's. But he doesn't pop out of the manhole until close to 3 p.m., when Lisa and Marge is racing back to the school. So basically, this sequence of Bart and Milhouse running from the Mafia lasts for nearly 3 hours. I'm not saying this is impossible or anything, they obviously cut tons of time out of the other 2 stories. They shouldn't be putting in multiple scenes of them running through the caves, come on. It's just funny how much less instantaneous it is than the episode suggests it is. When they run down this hallway and get cornered, this was actually going on for nearly 3 hours. Crazy. While we're here, we gotta give special mention to Alf Clausen's amazing score. He gave us that awesome pulsing homage to Run Lola Run during Lisa's story. But then during this chase sequence, we get these dramatic horns blaring, just crescendoing all the way to the final showdown. I love how, in Bart's version of these events, this chase sequence immediately continues into the streets. We, the audience, get a false sense of completion. Like, oh, we finally caught up. And then boom, no time for exposition, no time to explain. Let's go. The strongest aspect of Trilogy of Error's narrative, by far, is its sense of momentum. Despite resetting itself twice, the story always feels like it's building and building and building. Each story does have its slower moments, but each segment finishes progressively faster than the previous one. As an experiment, I tried watching Homer, Lisa, and Bart's Day in a couple different orders, omitting the climax of the story each time. For many, many, many reasons, the episode didn't really work as well. The reveals and stuff obviously wouldn't be as interesting in a different order. But the main issue was that it messed up the story's sense of momentum. As is, the story is sequenced in the best possible way to make it feel like a 20-minute long crescendo. One of the biggest knocks against Trilogy of Error is that it can sometimes be a little light on jokes. It's forced to repeat certain moments or situations for continuity purposes, and those moments really have to stand out. Homer's line, "I'm sorry, I thought he was a party robot," is cute and all, but it doesn't pack much of a punch during the second loop. Some of the time spent explaining the plot would normally be used to tell jokes. Since the Simpson family is so busy with all this stuff, the best jokes tend to come from the supporting characters. Chief Wiggum gets many great one-liners, and then Mr. Teeny and Dr. Nick have their memorable moments too. Also, hey, it's Coffee Addict Barney. Forgot that this episode fell into that era. I would say Linguo is the MVP though. All of his banter back and forth is great, especially with the mobsters during the climax. Poor Linguo, he was too good for this world. Speaking of the climax, we should probably talk about Marge. I really like that it's Marge who ultimately brings all 3 storylines together in the climax, by throwing Linguo into the fray. Even though the events are being told from Homer, Lisa, and Bart's point of view, You could argue that it's actually telling a story about how Marge supports her family from 3 different points of view. When Marge isn't involved, none of the characters ever get significantly closer to their goal. Marge is definitely the glue that holds this crazy adventure together, which is why I'm glad she plays such a key role in the climax. Trilogy of Air is low-key one of the best Marge episodes in the series' history. In the end, Lisa's story resolves Bart's story, which in turn resolves Lisa and Homer's story. And Mr. Teeny says the plot doesn't make sense. We'll give him a break, but this is an unusually bad take from the esteemed Mr. Teeny. Especially in Season 12, this is the plot that they call out for not making sense. Sounds to me like someone on the writing staff was feeling self-conscious about the obsessively nerdy plot they constructed. Trilogy of Air is a supremely nerdy episode of The Simpsons when it comes down to it. For a show that loves to play it cool and lampshade its nonsensical moments, this episode puts a lot of effort into getting all those little details right. I read in its Wikipedia entry that the writer, Matt Selman, had the entire thing mapped out before even pitching it. That's kind of crazy. But it totally shows in the final product. I absolutely love how thoughtfully this whole thing was put together. At the beginning of this review, I questioned if Trilogy of Error was just 3 shallow stories being told in the most interesting way possible. And you know what? It probably is. I'm not going to argue that any of these stories would stack up to, like, Bart the Murderer or something. These are practically B-plots in comparison. However, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Trilogy of Error is a testament to great narrative devices, that the way the story is told adds significant value to the narrative. It matters how you reveal information, and the order you do it in. Why would you want to watch Pulp Fiction in chronological order? What's the fun in that? Yes, I may be a total sucker for this kind of format, but for my money, Trilogy of Error is easily one of the best Simpsons episodes of the 2000s. I hope someday we finally get the sequel, where we find out what Maggie was doing the entire time.